In 1960, Singapore was a slum. Over half the population lived in overcrowded shantytowns. Families of 10 shared single rooms. There was no running water, no sanitation, no hope. The British were leaving. The future looked bleak. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing, not in projects or ghettos, but in well-maintained high-rises with modern amenities. Home ownership rates are among the highest in the world, and the transformation happened in a single generation. This is the story of how one tiny nation solved the housing crisis that America couldn't, and the uncomfortable trade-offs they made to do it. Singapore became independent in 1965. It was a city-state with no natural resources, no hinterland, no obvious path to prosperity. The new government, led by Lee Kuan Yew, faced an immediate crisis. Where would people live? The slums were unsustainable. Fire was a constant danger. Disease spread easily. Social unrest was brewing. Something had to be done fast. The solution was the Housing and Development Board, known as HDB. This government agency would become the most ambitious public housing program in history. Within a decade, it would rehouse hundreds of thousands of people. Within 2 decades, it would transform Singapore's entire urban landscape. The first HDB flats were basic. Small apartments in utilitarian blocks. Nothing fancy, but they had running water. They had toilets. They had electricity. For families coming from shacks with none of these things, it was transformative. The government didn't just build housing. It sold housing. This is crucial to understanding why Singapore's approach worked when others failed. In America, public housing was rental. Residents had no ownership stake, no reason to maintain buildings, no wealth accumulation. When things went wrong, they had nothing to lose by leaving. Singapore did the opposite. HDB flats are purchased, not rented. Residents use their retirement savings held in mandatory accounts called the Central Provident Fund to pay mortgages. They own their homes. They build equity. They have every incentive to maintain their buildings and their communities. This ownership model changed everything. When you own your home, you care about your neighbors. You care about the common spaces. You participate in maintenance decisions. You're invested literally in your community's success. The scale of construction was staggering. In the 1960s and 70s, Singapore built tens of thousands of units every year. Entire neighborhoods appeared where there had been nothing. The landscape transformed so fast that residents joked they couldn't recognize their own city from year to year. But speed alone doesn't explain the success. The design evolved continuously based on feedback and changing needs. Early HDB flats were small because resources were scarce. As Singapore grew wealthier, the apartments grew larger. Common areas improved. Amenities expanded. Each generation of buildings learned from the mistakes of the previous one. The government also enforced ethnic integration. Singapore has Chinese, Malay, and Indian populations that historically lived in separate neighborhoods. Left alone, public housing might have replicated this segregation. Instead, HDB implemented ethnic quotas. Each block, each neighborhood, must reflect Singapore's overall demographic mix. No ethnic group can dominate any area. This was social engineering on a massive scale. Critics called it authoritarian. Supporters called it nation-building. The result, whatever you think of the methods, was a society where different ethnic groups live side by side, where children grow up with neighbors from different backgrounds, where the physical environment promotes integration rather than division. Compare this to Pruitt-Igoe. In St. Louis, public housing became synonymous with racial segregation and concentrated poverty. In Singapore, public housing became the foundation of a multiracial middle class. The differences aren't just about design or funding. They're about political will. Singapore's government decided that housing was too important to leave to the market. They committed resources, enforced rules, and took responsibility for outcomes. Now, I need to be honest about the trade-offs. Singapore's success came with costs that many societies would find unacceptable. The government controls almost all land in Singapore. If you want to build housing, you deal with the state. This gives HDB enormous power, but also eliminates the market competition that drives innovation in other countries. The ethnic quotas that promote integration also limit freedom. You can't always live where you want. You can't always sell to who you want. The government decides what mix of people each neighborhood should have. And the ownership model that builds wealth also creates dependency. Your retirement savings are tied up in your apartment. If housing prices fall, your retirement falls with them. The government has every incentive to keep prices high, which makes housing increasingly unaffordable for young people. There's also the question of what public housing looks like when the government controls it for 60 years. HDB estates can feel monotonous, block after block of similar buildings. Efficient, but not inspiring. Residents sometimes describe feeling like they live in a well-maintained machine rather than a vibrant community. The mandatory savings system that finances home purchases also means less money for other things. Singaporeans have high savings rates but limited disposable income. The trade-off is security for flexibility, and dissent is not really welcome. Singapore's political system tolerates limited opposition. Complaining about HDB policies too loudly can have consequences. The efficiency of the housing system is connected to the efficiency of political control. These trade-offs don't make Singapore's achievement less impressive. They make it more complicated. The same government power that enabled rapid housing construction also enabled restrictions on freedom that other democracies wouldn't accept. So what can other countries actually learn from Singapore? First, that public housing can work at scale. The idea that government is inherently bad at housing is disproven by Singapore's example. With proper design, funding, and management, public housing can provide quality homes for millions of people. Second, that ownership matters. Giving residents a stake in their homes transforms their relationship to their community. It's not enough to provide shelter. You have to provide investment. Third, that integration requires intention. Left alone, housing patterns tend toward segregation. Creating mixed communities requires active intervention. Whether that intervention should be as aggressive as Singapore's quotas is debatable. That some intervention is necessary seems clear. Fourth, that housing policy is really social policy. The decisions we make about where people live shape education, employment, health, and social cohesion. Housing isn't just about buildings. It's about what kind of society we want to be. But the lessons have limits. Singapore is a city-state of 6 million people. It has no rural areas, no regional politics, no federal system to navigate. Decisions can be made and implemented quickly because there's nowhere for opposition to gather strength. What works in Singapore might not work in a large, diverse democracy. The political compromises required to build consensus might water down the policies until they're ineffective. The local resistance that blocks development in American cities would be impossible in Singapore's system. This is the fundamental tension. Singapore solved housing by concentrating power. Can housing be solved without concentrating power? Can democratic societies achieve similar results through democratic means? Vienna suggests maybe yes. Austria's capital has extensive public housing that's remained popular and well-maintained for nearly a century. It was built by democratic socialists, not authoritarians. It proves that you don't need Singapore's political system to build Singapore-quality housing. But Vienna built its housing in a different era, when government intervention was more accepted, when construction costs were lower, when global capital didn't flow as freely. Whether that model could be replicated today is unclear. What is clear is that the housing crisis in most major cities is a choice. We have the resources to house everyone. We have examples of how to do it. We lack only the political will. Singapore looked at a crisis and decided to solve it. They made hard choices. They spent money. They exercised power. And they housed their population. America looked at the same crisis and decided the market would handle it. The market didn't. 50 years later, homelessness is rising, rents are unaffordable, and public housing remains associated with failure rather than success. The question isn't whether Singapore's model is perfect. It isn't. The question is whether we're willing to try anything at all, or whether we'll keep pretending that the market will eventually solve a problem it has no incentive to solve. Singapore's housing story is ultimately about ambition. The ambition to believe that a problem can be solved. The ambition to commit resources to solving it. The ambition to see housing not as a commodity, but as a foundation for society. That ambition is what's missing in most places. Not the money, not the expertise, the will. If you want to explore more stories about how cities shape society, stick around. I'll see you in the next one.